We would be honored if you would join us.
1982's Piranha II, The Spawning, or Piranha II, Flying Killers, or Piranha, Part 2, The Spawning. I'm going to go with Piranha 2 going forward because this is already hurting my head and it's likely getting on your nerves as well. So, when 1975's Jaws hit big, one man was not messing around. That would be Roger Corman, the late perpetrator of low-budget films. And when he saw another film hit, he was minded to come up with some kind of imitator to take advantage of that. And so his imitator of Jaws would be Piranha, a 1978 movie directed by the brilliant Joe Dante, written by indie movie hero John Sayles, who's gone on to make films like Lone Star, for instance, and Matuan. And here he was, right near the start of his career, writing stuff like this. Brilliant. So it's incredible pedigree for the film, which remains a slice of schlocky fun and a successful one as well. I mean, when you consider the modest budget it was working to, the fact that it brought in over $10 million in cinema receipts around the world, that was really quite something. Now, Piranha was the film that nearly didn't get released at all because Universal was very aware of its similarities to Jaws and just what it was taking advantage of the success of. And at one stage, the studio had actually looked to take out an injunction to block the release of Piranha altogether. In the end, it was Steven Spielberg's intervention that stopped it pressing ahead with any kind of legal action. And so Piranha could go off and make its money. And the fact that a modest budget film made over 10 million at cinemas meant one thing: sequel. We're going to get another one. Although, strangely enough, Roger Corman wasn't looking to press ahead with it himself. Now, two people who were producers Jeff Shetman and Chaco Van Leeuwen. They were straight away looking forward to Piranha 2. Corman, though, through his New World Pictures, was more focused on a film called Humanoids of the Deep. Now, this came up on episode 400 of Film Stories when producer Gail Ann Hurd, she of The Abyss and The Terminator, talked about how she wanted to go and get her hands dirty on a movie before going off to make a film with James Cameron. Humanoids of the Deep was the film that she made, and what do you know, we're going to come to the one that James Cameron made. And so, in the case of Piranha, what Corman agreed to do was sell the sequel rights to the producers of the film, and they then got to work moving forward with a script that Martin B. Cohen came up with an original outline, and then it was Charles H. Egley and Channing Gibson who were working on a screenplay for whatever Piranha 2 was going to be. Who was going to direct? Good question. Well, Joe Dante, I've done that thing of you ask yourself a question and answering it. From now on, whenever I do this in this podcast, I'm going to give myself a demerit mark. I apologise. But Joe Dante was moving on to his next film, The Howling, a real stepping stone in his career, The Howling would be. And so it was Miller Drake who was first hired as the director of the Piranha sequel, another veteran of the Roger Corman company. He'd worked alongside Joe Dante as well. And Drake then started working with Charles H. Egley on progressing the script. And so, as he would explain to DVD Newsflash, I pitched this idea of bringing Kevin McCarthy back, all chewed up and mutilated from the previous movie. Very mild spoiler for the previous movie there, but not a massive one. And so Drake said he was on an abandoned oil rig and he was developing these, here are two words I've never said on this podcast, flying piranhas out there to get revenge. Those flying piranhas actually would inspire the way the facehuggers moved in 1986's Alien. True story. And so, but he was thinking of bringing one or two people back from the original film. There was going to be a fish tank in it. A head was going to be smashed through the fish tank. I mean, he had an idea of how he wanted to do it. He'd also was talking to Rob Bottin, famous, of course, for his amazing physical effects in the years that followed, to come in and do the makeup on the work. But before he could hire him, Drake was off the film because enter stage left Ovidio G. Assonitis, who was now producing the film. He got involved. He bought the rights to the movie off the previous producers. He gave them a nominal credit, but he got rid of their script, and soon he got rid of Drake as well. Rob Bottin's chance to make Piranha 2 was over. And so Asanitis then needed a director. So let's have a look at where James Cameron was at this point. He never directed a feature film, and instead he was working on the film Galaxy of Terror, doing some of his effects work. I mean, Cameron did effects work on a bunch of movies. In the case of Galaxy of Terror, there was an infamous story of how he managed to coax, how do I put this phrase as well, an acting performance of sorts from some maggots. And his ingenuity and his left field approach to stuff was already giving him a bit of a reputation as someone to have a chat to. And it was over at the Terminator files that James Cameron explained that he'd originally got into Roger Corman's world via a man called Chuck Comiskey. Now, he was head of special effects on the film Battle Beyond the Stars that Cameron was then brought into, because Cameron just explained, I just knocked on their door one day with this reel I put together. He said, I was totally broke. I needed a job. I thought, I've got to get my hands dirty in the real film world, even if it's like totally down and dirty, Corman style. And so Cameron said, I presented myself as a special effects cameraman because I'd done some matte work and some miniature work, and they had that covered. And in the end, what they did on Galaxy of Terror was they hired him as a builder of models for the film. And he said, I built the model of the main character's ship. Now, we're going to talk memories for a minute here, so bear with me. There's no way I can get round this. Cameron said it was a very goofy design. He described it as, quote, a spaceship with tits. Imagine that. And he said, hopefully the one and only spaceship with tits. And he says, I guess that's why I got Piranha 2. Now, what he's alluding to there is in the Piranha films, there are people in swimwear, and not all of the swimwear is particularly proficient at what it needed to do. And so, as Cameron said, I guess the producers figured the guy who could come up with the spaceship with tits must be able to do something with flying piranha. Now, there were different accounts to how he then got on to Piranha 2 as director. Asanitis was talking about one particular story. In fact, let's go back to Jeff Shetman, the original producer, and he just said Jim was involved in the picture, doing some art direction, even back then was impressive. And he said, the decision got made, let's make him the director. And then Miller Drake said he'd already hired James Cameron to work on the effects of the film. And in fact, Drake's gone on to work on several James Cameron films afterwards. Either way, the decision was made before really Asanitis got his hands on him. Now, Cameron would explain to the Los Angeles Times that he was, quote, warned by a lot of people that Piranha 2 would be a bad experience, but it looked like a shot, so I took it. He did indeed sign on the dotted line, and it was indeed a bad experience. Now, the film had already been delayed. The Hollywood Reporter at one stage had said it was going to be filming in the summer of 1980 with a script in place and a $1.5 million budget. But at that point, United Artists, which was looking to distribute, was said to have script approval. By the time we got to the end of 1980, the plan was now to shoot it in December of that year. Imagine a Piranha film being made in the winter. Lovely. That didn't happen either. Then it was a start date of May 1981. So we got a few delays before they got on set. But eventually they decamped to Jamaica to make the film. And as is well known, within 2 to 3 weeks of filming, James Cameron was no longer on set directing the film because Asanitis had appointed himself as the director. Now, Daily Dead did a very big interview with Asanitis about all of this, because once Cameron was off the film, it was retooled, and let's just say more shots without the luxury of clothes were brought in and things like that. And so, Asanitis said that we moved from Rome to where the film was being put together and pre-production and writing was being done, to Jamaica to start shooting. And he said, on the first day, I took Cameron aside. Listen, Jim, I like you. You're intelligent. You have interesting ideas. You're a visionary, he says, which is true. He's a visionary, as Asanitis confers. He says, you've got a great sense of style, but you've got no experience. I sincerely hope you do as far as special effects are concerned, but as a director, you have none. And so Asanitis argued he'd surrounded him with technicians and collaborators who had decades of experience working with everyone from Alfonso Brescia to Fellini. Describe what you want, he said to his novice director, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you. That's why they're here, to support you and help bring your vision to the screen. Didn't go well, this, because that all happened on the first day, and on the second day, Asanitis realised Cameron hadn't listened. Now, this is one side of the story, to be clear. And by the 8th day, the producer was lamenting the fact that the film was 6 days behind schedule because his director was said to be experimenting. Now, Cameron experiments a lot on his films, that's fine. But as Asanitis would argue, they didn't have a lot of money. They were on a tight schedule, a small budget, that he'd managed to get $500,000. I think it was off Warner Brothers to make the film, but Asanitis was trying to do even cheaper than that. And in fact, I mean, the cast would reflect on this. I mean, the cast of the film, Trisha O'Neill, Steve Marichurch, Lance Henriksen, Ted Risher, Ricky G. Paul, Leslie Graves. In the end, actually, the screenplay was credited to Charles H. Egley and James Cameron. I didn't do this earlier. Cameron is credited as the director of the film, but the cast would note that it was just getting cheaper as they went along. And so Asanitis would say that the crew were complaining, and so he had to act. But there was a theory that Cameron put forward that, amongst others, that actually Asanitis wanted to direct the film himself, that he got rid of Cameron. He took the movie on, and so that was how it was shot. That was how it was done. And so once the physical production was done, the editing, well, that throws up even more stories of Piranha 2. Because at first it was said that James Cameron had nothing to do with the editing of the film. And then there's a lovely story, and I mean, it's a grey story because he's not entirely sure how true it is. But that while Asanitis was off at the Cannes Film Festival, Cameron was going into the editing room and slowly cutting his own version of the film. The story was that he'd flown to Rome, where the film was being edited at his own expense, and he didn't have much money, would go into the editing room at night and put his own version together. Now, as a video G. Asanitis would say in his interview with Daily Dead, he said, "After a couple of weeks, the editor tells me, you know, you're going to make me rich with this film. You'll be the one to put my kids through university." And he said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we're going to take ages editing. You come and tell me to edit a scene a certain way, then Cameron arrives and undoes everything, only to end up doing what you told me to do in the first place." And the editor said, "I'm getting paid either way." But, I mean, what Asanitis realised was there were 2 editors on the film. There were 2 people doing it. And he said he was going to film school at my expense. So again, I had to be firm. "Jim, I forbid you to put a foot in the editing room." Well, Cameron has been quite coy about whether this story was true or not. But either way, I mean, when the film got to the US, Cameron was said to have held a screening of Piranha 2 for Piranha 1 director Joe Dante. And as Dante was quoted as saying, "I told him I thought he'd done a terrific job with his section of the movie, because what are you going to do with a flying piranha movie? There's only so much that you can do with it." I mean, the version that was ultimately released of Piranha 2 in cinemas was not James Cameron's cut of the film. I mean, the story is still far from done. It was released in August 1982 in Italy. It got a release in November 1982 in the US. And whereas there'd been quite a lot of people who enjoyed the first movie, there were not people who were particularly enjoying the second. The reviews for it were absolutely savage. People were talking of it, it's the worst film. I mean, it's that kind of schlocky, rubbishy film. They were gunning for it. Absolutely gunning for it. And I mean, the film got its release, but in terms of the commercial performance of the film, I mean, there's not even particular box office figures available for it. I mean, the quoted final budget of the film is around $150,000. I've seen also that it quoted as $300,000. Either way, in terms of film budgets, we're talking beer mat levels of money. I mean, this was scrimping around. And I'd imagine it made its money back in cinemas and distribution at the time, just by nature of the fact that it was so cheap, and also it had Piranha in the title. Universal was happily making money out of Jaws sequels, after all. But Cameron would reflect many years later on how the version that went into cinemas wasn't his, but still had his name on it. Contractually, it was still his name on it. And so he said, "I was replaced after 2.5 weeks on the shoot by the Italian producer. He just fired me and took over, which is what he wanted to do when he hired me," Cameron alleged. And he said, "It wasn't until much later that I even figured out what had happened." And he said, "It was like, oh man, I thought I was doing a good job. But when I saw what they were cutting together, it was horrible. And then the producer wouldn't take my name off the picture because contractually they weren't allowed to deliver it with an Italian name," Cameron says. So they left me on no matter what. I had no legal power to influence him from California, where I was actually sleeping on a friend's couch. I didn't know an attorney. And he said, in actual fact, I did some directing on that film, but I don't feel it was my first movie. And in fact, for many years, Cameron would describe the 1984's The Terminator as his first movie, in much the same way that David Fincher talks about how Alien 3 wasn't his first movie, when, I mean, it's the first one he's credited as director on, but because what ended up on screen there was so far away from his vision of the film, he just doesn't consider it his film. In the case of Piranha 2, it was pretty much the same for James Cameron, although you do sense that he's softened towards it in more recent years, because whilst Asanites just, his career didn't soar particularly, Cameron went on to do The Terminator. Then he did Aliens. Then he did The Abyss. Then he did Terminator 2. Then he won every Oscar in Mankind with Titanic, and so on and so on. And so the power dynamic completely inverted there. And over time, Cameron has been able to get access to the film again. And so he bought the footage and he did a recut version many years down the line. And that version has since found its way onto home media formats. And so the theatrical release of the film is 94 minutes long. The director's cut of the film is 84 minutes long. And so Cameron, I mean, you look at something like Spielberg's assorted takes on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There are, I mean, he would tinker with that quite a few times, and the length sometimes would get shorter on it. In the case of Piranha 2, Cameron would note that Cameron's version of it was shorter. And in fact, he would go on 60 minutes in 2010 and, I mean, jokingly describe just a bit more upbeat about Piranha 2, joking that it's the best a flying piranha film ever made. Still, the reviews are savage, but the versions out there now, you can get both cuts of the film. Gale Anne Hurd and James Cameron would then, after they got a film each under their belt, come together for 1984's The Terminator. There had been plans for further Piranha films. There was going to be a Piranha 3, but, I mean, when Piranha 2 did nowhere near the business of the original Piranha, that idea just kind of disappeared. The original movie was remade in 1995, and then we got the reboot series when the 3D boom came along again at the start of 2010s. It was Alexandra Aja who did Piranha 3D in 2010, then Piranha 3 Double D, ho, 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 ho. In 2012, that was directed by John Gulliger. And so the Piranha, so far to date, there have been 5 Piranha movies. There were plans for more of them, but Piranha 2, whichever title, whichever cut you go with, has now become one of cinema's curios, really, for the first film from arguably the most commercially successful film director of all time. Piranha 2 didn't make as much money as Avatar 2. Personally, I think I'd rather sit through the former, though.